And welcome back to the Touchline Talk show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to hit that subscribe button. I want to say that one more time, as always, so you don't miss any of the content I am putting out. It is time to talk Jesse Marsch. Just sort of what happened, looking back on his tenure at Leeds, and moving forward, what is next for him. I very briefly mentioned this in the YouTube short I did, but I want to start with once again saying Jesse Marsch didn't fail. Jesse Marsch was unable to get his team to overachieve. There is obviously an important difference between the two. It is what separates people like Sean Dyche and Eddie Howe from most managers. This seemed to get way more complicated than it needed to be because I saw so many people questioning both of those hires. Or at least saying, Dyche got relegated basically got Burnley relegated. Is he really the guy for Everton? Howe took a team with plenty of championship players and turned him into one of the best attacking teams in the Premier League. Dyche took a Burnley team full of championship players, got him into the Europa League, consistently got him, safe in the Premier League, away from relegation for a while, and eventually, after 5, 6, 7 seasons, it came crumbling down for both of them. 5, 6, 7 seasons. They overachieved dramatically. And what are they? Eddie Howe then elevating Newcastle. Sean Dyche looking really good so far at Everton. This isn't hard. That's where Jesse Marsch came up short. That team is not good enough right now. And the way they started against Manchester United in that first game without him didn't look good for him for a while, but ultimately they conceded and blew that lead. Specifically defensively, they are just not good enough. And you're starting what is essentially 3 center backs and Luke Ayling, who can also play center back. I will never understand why Kai Wagner is not on that team right now. He made all the sense in the world. They didn't get that deal done. The Philadelphia Union are going to benefit incredibly from it come MLS. So he took a team that was, 15th, 16th, 17th and kept them right about that spot. Eventually that is going to get you fired. This wasn't surprising. It felt like it was a question of when, not if. Because the results simply weren't good enough. You look at every other team that's battling relegation. They've all fired their managers too. It happens every single season. Because you can't afford to wait for somebody to figure it out and hope they figure it out when you are facing the financial ramifications that come with getting relegated. If it is not getting fixed, you have to pull the trigger. And the other part of this is kind of the optics of firing him immediately after you have this transfer window, you spend this money, you bring in Weston McKennie, all of that. And, well, of course, the optics of that aren't great. And it's fair to wonder, why did you fire a guy immediately after you just spent all this money in the transfer window? And landed, a U.S. international and, Maximilian Vober, by the way, a guy with Red Bull connections, a guy with connections to Marsch. They didn't just sign some guys. No, not that he had connections to every player they signed, but they signed some guys he has connections to. My pushback to that and my question would be, okay, so after the World Cup, when was the right time to fire him? Or just generally, the way that the World Cup messed up this season, when is the right time to fire somebody if you're not firing them before the World Cup break? Because you come back on Boxing Day, and if you didn't fire somebody before the World Cup, why would you be firing them 1 or 2 games after it? So then you're in January, and, okay, you've had 2 or 3 games maybe to evaluate. Is your mind going to change that much? Now, maybe. Then you get into kind of the time frame Everton went with, which is we're going to make the change just in time to have somebody at the very end of the transfer window who can't really be part of the transfer window. And that's not particularly helpful either. There just is no good way to do this when you don't have the month of December to play games. That was the problem that the entire league ran into. Because if you wanted somebody to be there for the transfer window, you needed them before the World Cup. As opposed to playing, what seems like every other day throughout the festive period, and then on January 4th, January 5th, January 6th, look up and go, we've lost 4 of 5 and are now in the relegation zone. We're going to make the change on January 7th so that by January 12th, we have a new manager in, and there are still 2 weeks left in the transfer window or even more to get some of that manager's players in. That's just not how this season worked. So, yeah, it was bad timing. There just isn't good timing until you're getting into the point where it might be too late to save the season. And yeah, I would rather be proactive than reactive in that sense. So he didn't fail. He did fine. And fine at a team that is a relegation candidate just isn't good enough. This shouldn't really dramatically alter his chances of getting other jobs. Now, he's not getting another Premier League one. But he should get other offers, or at least interest from teams in top 5 leagues. League Serie A, something like that. It's not like this is European adventure is over for him. But the timing of this becomes very interesting because of the U.S. men's national team situation. I have been consistent in my belief that you ask me who I want managing the U.S. men's national team, my answer has been Jesse Marsch. I also was convinced Jesse Marsch was not leaving the Premier League to go manage the U.S. men's national team 4 years before a World Cup. Now the situation is different. But there are a couple points I want to get to here and then bring another thing that happened this week into the conversation. First of all, you need to find and this is kind of where I went with the Berhalter conversation before all of the Reina drama came out. You have to find a better alternative. And that starts with finding somebody. Now, at this point, there are better alternatives than Berhalter. But you got to find somebody who actually wants the job. Right? You can throw all these names out there. My point back then, before Jesse Marsch was fired and before Berhalter kind of became untenable as a option moving forward, was who do you want ahead of the guy who just did a fine job at the World Cup? Again, this was before all the drama came. So you can talk about Jose Mourinho or whoever else. Do they want to spend the next 4 years preparing for, 2 major tournaments and having games 4 times a year or whatever it is, 5, 6 times, living in the United States, preparing for something that's happening in 3.5 years? Maybe. Which gets to my first point, which is if you're the U.S. Soccer Federation, you have to exhaust all your options. Yes, you go ask Zinedine Zidane if he wants the job. If he laughed you out of the room, fine. He's probably not taking it. It's a long shot. But you ask the question. You make him say no. It's just like anything else. What's the worst thing that can happen? They say no. Okay, then you move on. Go after everybody you can possibly think of. The problem is going to be that most of the people that you would, or just generically fans seem to want, you have to sell them on the significance of this upcoming World Cup because you don't have much else to sell them on. You don't get to work with players every single day. If we're talking about a European manager, right, you're in a foreign country. Those European managers don't have an attachment to the U.S. in terms of feeling some kind of national pride, which isn't, again, it's not a deal breaker. You got to turn over every single stone and see what your options are and who actually has interest. But you got to make sure somebody has interest before these, you feel like we're just throwing these names around and not thinking about this practically. Because the way you're going to sell this job, because the national team jobs in general, especially on one that is not, Brazil, France, Argentina, whoever, is a difficult one. Because a lot of the top managers don't want to manage national teams. They want the day-to-day process. And Jesse Marsch is certainly, I would argue, in that camp. Not that he's one of the world's best managers, but that he loves the day-to-day process of running a club. That's why you have this sort of odd collection of national team managers with resumes that aren't all that impressive. And so, how do you sell the significance of the World Cup? You do what Jim Curtin did during his appearance on the Crack podcast, which is hosted in part by DeMarcus Beasley and Oguchi Onweyu. So, former U.S. internationals who know how this World Cup thing works. Jim Curtin went on this podcast and said, for a second time, but I thought he was kind of just making a generic point the first time, and this time he was very clear and very specific, that if he was asked to be an assistant to the next U.S. men's national team manager, he would leave the Philadelphia Union to do so. Because that is the significance he believes this World Cup carries to the future of Major League Soccer and soccer in this country. Can you get Jose Mourinho, just as a hypothetical example? Now, also, Mourinho loves Los Angeles, so this might not be as hard of a sell as I'm kind of making it here. Always love those LA preseasons. But can you convince somebody who doesn't have a vested interest in MLS about what this is going to do for soccer in the United States moving forward? That's the part of this I'm really curious about. Because you certainly don't have to sell Jim Curtin, and it's sounding less and less like you have to sell Jesse Marsch. There's part of me that still thinks Jesse Marsch wants to be in Europe, and that Jesse Marsch has just gotten to a point in his managerial career, for understandable reasons, where he's viewing it from a European perspective. But that doesn't seem to be the vibe since he got fired. I would feel very good if Jesse Marsch got this job. There's no reason to hire him this minute. Again, you have got to go through the process. I would wait until, unless you've got a very good reason not to, wait until the club season is over and start seeing if you can convince somebody who's higher on your list. Because Jesse Marsch has his flaws. His system has its flaws. I believe, philosophically, from a mentality standpoint, he is a great fit for this team. That's really what this is about to me. Is that what he brings is what this team needs. It's not about the tactics as much as just his teams do not quit on him. They play for him. Regardless of the results, he demands that intensity. He brings that confidence. I love the way he carries himself. That doesn't necessarily mean he is the obvious, he is the obvious choice. That doesn't necessarily mean he's the right choice. All I know at this point is that if Jim Curtin is not, unless he somehow backs off of these comments, and it's certainly, watching him say them, did not appear he was going to do so. If Jim Curtin is not an assistant coach on this, whatever this U.S. men's national team head coaching staff looks like, oh, by the way, you should also get your people in charge in place before you pick your coach. It sounds like it's going to go that way. So you've got time on this. If he is not on this coaching staff, somebody has neglected their job. He said he would leave his position to be an assistant. He did not care who the head coach was. This is a guy who, for my money, is the best coach in MLS. And also brings so many leadership skills that are different from the ones Jesse Marsch offers. I also, until now, was not convinced Jim Curtin wanted this job. I thought Jim Curtin was looking to Europe after he won something with the Union. But it has become abundantly clear that Jim Curtin may care more about this World Cup than anybody else. If it's a Marsch-Curtin combination, if it's Curtin, at this point I don't really care, and I might even want Curtin first. Because I don't know if I've ever seen a coach who is a better, specifically in soccer, who is a better leader of a team than Jim Curtin. So even if you decide he's not the guy you want the European experience, you want the fact that Jesse Marsch has worked with a lot of these guys and has Champions League experience, or you want to go try and get the bigger European name, that's totally fine. But Jim Curtin needs to be on that staff. One, because he is terrific with people. Look at that Union team. You look at the way he talks. I mean, even on this podcast, he told his former player, Oguchi Onweyu, and basically said, yeah, I got it wrong. I didn't play you enough. I'm looking back at that team we had. We should have been better. I clearly made some mistakes. Who does that? The more I listen to Jim Curtin, the more convinced I am about how special he is. And then there's also just the familiarity, the cultural side of this, that if you have a European manager, for example, getting a guy who knows MLS, who knows where these players came from, who has coached, both Aaronsons, is around all of the guys coming from that New York, Philly area, connected within U.S. soccer, that's incredibly valuable as well. And then there's also the fact that he turned the Union into the best defensive team that MLS has ever seen. Particularly if Jesse Marsch is the head coach. Somebody has to be there to solve the defensive issues. Because that's where he struggled in two areas at Leeds. One was finishing chances, which to me is a commentary on the players much more than it is him. Because it's not like they failed to create them for the most part. They just failed to capitalize on them. At that point, I don't know what the coach is supposed to do. That's about the players on the field. The second part is there is a massive defensive vulnerability to the way he plays. Jim Curtin plays a similar style. Jim Curtin has basically turned the Union, with the help of Ernst Tanner, has turned the Union into the closest thing Major League Soccer has to a Red Bull team at this point. And again, they were the best defensive team in the history of the league last season, while scoring a ridiculous amount of goals. Jim Curtin has found a way to balance this. I understand it's MLS, not the Premier League. I get it. But and as good as those back four are, and as good as Andre Blake is, they were on a level you have not seen in this league. You need his defensive expertise, particularly if you're going to go with Jesse Marsch. Again, this guy has said, I will give up my job to go be an assistant. If you want to hire him as the head coach, fantastic. I will have no issues with that whatsoever. So I say all this just to go back to this idea of there are people out there, evidently, who are kind of all in on this World Cup. And Jim Curtin basically said, we as coaches need to be able to humble ourselves to make sure this goes as well as it possibly can, whatever that is, whether that's being an assistant coach, whatever. Go figure out who else is on board with this. Maybe it's just Jim Curtin. But I'm sure there are conversations going on. If this is kind of where it's turning, again, leave no stone unturned. You have got to find the very best coaching staff you can, whether that's involving a head coach with no connections to the U.S. or Major League Soccer, whether that's Jesse Marsch, whether that's Jim Curtin. And then you've got to sort of fill in the cracks and balance this thing out. Because If it's Jose Mourinho, you're asking a guy who thrives in chaos to come into a situation that has been chaos. I don't like that combination. I want Jim Curtin there to kind of be the balance to that and to do the relational side of it. If it's Jesse Marsch, love the way he plays, love the way he kind of approaches everything. Not good enough defensively. There's a fundamental flaw in his approach. As much as I love it, there is a downside to it. Go get the guy who figured out how to balance a very similar style of play in Philly and turn the Union into a defensive juggernaut. There are ways to fill this coaching staff out. Or bring in Jesse Marsch as kind of your pressing expert, even if now maybe Jesse Marsch won't take an assistant job. You got to just cast the wide net and figure out what happens. But I wanted to bring up these Jim Curtin comments because they have really changed how I am looking at this. And again, maybe it's just him. But this guy turned the Union into, from a goal difference standpoint, I mean, he won a supporter shield, so he turned him to the best team in the league. And then he put together one of the best seasons the league has ever seen on top of that. And he is telling you he is prioritizing the World Cup above all else. How many other people are thinking that way? Is there somebody outside of sort of the U.S. soccer family who sees the World Cup in a somewhat similar way? Because if not, you're probably not going to find a better option than some kind of Jim Curtin, Jesse Marsch combination. Because you're not going to be able to convince the people you want to take this job. But Jim Curtin gave you a blueprint. Maybe it'll work on somebody that, without that kind of argument, the U.S. wouldn't have much of a hope of landing. I don't know. This can't be just, this is Jesse Marsch's job, we're done, don't have to worry about it. I still feel very comfortable if Jesse Marsch gets this job. But that should not happen in the near future. There's too much to sort out before that. There are too many questions to be answered. There are too many people to talk to. You got to do your due diligence on this. But what Jim Curtin was saying was truly fascinating to me. And so I wanted to bring that into the conversation as well, if for no other reason to say you have one of your assistant coaches, at the very least. And obviously he's close with Jesse Marsch. That would be a terrific duo if you can land both of them. But whoever you end up with, you have got to fill, it's not just about the head coach, because the head coach is going to have shortcomings. If you can find other people like Jim Curtin, draw on all the expertise you can. This is just a different hiring process than anything the U.S. has been through before, because you have this one opportunity at home with the potential to lure a big-time manager, maybe, the potential to hire a former U.S. international who has managed in the Champions League and the Premier League, who is currently out of a job, and you have arguably the best coach in your domestic league saying he will give up his position even if you don't offer him the head coaching job. You got to get this right. I don't necessarily know what that is, because you got to figure out who are your viable options. And then you go from there and evaluate which one is the best. So I don't like the speculation, because half the names that get thrown out there aren't taking this job. You still got to ask the question, just like with Zidane. The U.S. soccer did the right thing. We just got to change the conversation and kind of how we're thinking about this. So, because I have no good answer on whether Jesse Marsch should be the manager. It's certainly not a bad option. I don't know if it's the best, because I don't know who else would take the job. That's what you have to answer before this job gets offered to Jesse Marsch. Because the answer very well might be, we don't feel like anybody's a better option for a variety of reasons. All I know is Jim Curtin just laid out an argument that was incredibly compelling. I just don't know if it's going to work on somebody outside the U.S. because do they care about the future of Major League Soccer and the future of soccer in the United States if they have no vested interest in the United States? I mean, maybe you can use it on somebody, but go check out what Jim Curtin said. It was fascinating. Gives you real insight into kind of where he's at, what he views this World Cup as. Changed the way I'm kind of thinking about all this, to be completely transparent. So, Jesse Marsch out at Leeds. Maybe the next manager of the U.S. men's national team. Maybe he ends up in Europe. Somewhere else. We'll have to see. Again, I'm not entirely convinced he wants this job, but I'm getting closer to the point where I am. So, we shall see. But once again, just to sum up the whole thing here, Jesse Marsch didn't fail. He was unable to get his team to overachieve and to maximize his team. When you're in a relegation battle, that's not good enough. Whatever the next U.S. coaching staff is, should have Jim Curtin on it. And Jesse Marsch should be one of the people that is in the conversation for that job. But you've got to go find you've got time. Go figure out and ask every single person you possibly can. Cast an incredibly wide net and then take your options that are actually realistic and then go make your choice. There's too much riding on this next U.S. coaching staff to just hand it to anybody, even Jesse Marsch.